I got an email that you guys asked me to come and talk about toxicology, which is really a soft spot of mine. I love toxicology. Where I did my residency training was in Philadelphia, and we have a lot of poisoning there. So much so that we have a subspecialty program for training in toxicology. So you become a doctor, you do your residency, and then afterwards you can do additional training in toxicology. And the toxicologists who worked where I trained, they were all crazy. I mean, they were all crazy. Very, very smart people. I don't know if anyone has family members who are toxicologists, but they're really brilliant people. You sit around all day arguing about fairly meaningless things. They drink too much coffee, and they're very bright people. So toxicology is one of my favorite topics in medicine, and this lecture is designed for you guys. I created it myself, so hopefully you guys will enjoy it. If anything is too advanced or not advanced enough, if it's boring and painful, let me know, and we can change it a little. So toxicology for the ENT. Toxicology is So toxicology is really interesting because we'll talk about these poisons, and toxicology is kind of scary because you think about all the poisons that we interact with, and even everyday things like Tylenol or aspirin. If you take enough of it, the common denominator is seizure, coma, and death. It's pretty frightening, right? And when we sit and we talk about case reviews, and we always do case reviews in medicine, and someone stands in the room and say, well, patient comes in with altered mental status or a seizure or cardiac arrest. There's about a list of toxins or drugs that we interact with on an everyday level, and sometimes, very rarely, that cause seizure, coma, and death. So it's very real. Toxicology is all over the place. Every patient I see, I'm always asking myself, am I missing a toxicology emergency? And even though everything, at the end of the day, can cause seizure, coma, and death in terms of toxicology, very few people develop seizure, coma, and death. And for the most part, when I see poison patients in the ER, what do I do with them? I do some blood work, I do a cardiogram, I give them some fluids, I watch them for a couple hours, and I send them home. So it's very interesting because you see both ends of the spectrum. The lethality, meaning it can cause a lot of sickness and death, the potential is very high. But in the end, very few times that people interact with these drugs do we end up with seizure, coma, and death. So I'm assuming for some people in the room, this is their first introduction to toxicology. Toxicology is the study of poisons. And we can interact with poisons, and there's a lot of subspecialties with respect to toxicology. There's environmental toxicology, occupational toxicology, right? You guys, as soon as you become a member of Post 53, you get hours worth of painful, boring OSHA lectures, right? You can thank the occupational toxicologists. Recreational toxicology, right? What does that mean? That means on a Saturday night, someone's sitting in their car smoking pot, right? So there's recreational toxicology, and then there's medicinal toxicology, right? And that's what I try and study. So medical toxicology. So in order to talk about toxicology, you have to assume that there was an exposure. You had to come in contact with something that has the potential to cause bodily harm. And how do we come in contact with toxins? We can swallow them, we can inhale them, we can snort them, we can get it on our skin, we can even put things up our rectum. We can put it in our vagina, right, if you have one. We can get stuff in our eyes. We shoot stuff in our veins. And what does intrathecal mean? Does anyone know what that means? Intrathecal? Any takers? Intrathecal means directly into the spinal cord. All right? So sometimes people have intrathecal medication drugs. People who have abnormal muscle tone, like people who have cerebral palsy, and they have pumps that go into their spinal cord, and that's called intrathecal medication. So who is this? Anyone know? Another random dead guy, right? Who is this? but I think I have 50 cents in my pocket. Who is it? That's pretty close. I think we work with Galilee. So this is a guy named Paracelsus. And Paracelsus is the father of modern toxicology. And I think he really did work with Galileo and Da Vinci, and he was kind of in that crowd. So Paracelsus is the father of modern toxicology. And the reason he's famous is because he developed something called the dose-response relationship. And what he said was, if you interact with something, there has to be a certain dose to cause a certain response. Right? It's something that today's time you wouldn't think is all that brilliant, but back in the day it was. And that concept developed something called the LD50. So someone said, what? What is it? Someone said it. What is it? I heard you say it.
Lethal dose.
Lethal dose what?
They kill 50% of the population.
Good, so flush that out. I mean, what you're saying is exactly right, but explain it. Or read it off the slide. All right. Well, what he said is exactly right. If you come in contact with something, what is the amount that you have to come in contact with that will kill 50% of the usually we talk about in animals, right? Because we can't, it's technically unethical to do LD50 studies on people, right? So what they do is they usually take mice, because a mouse will make a good human model, and they expose it to chemicals, and they take a chemical and they say, well, how much can we give, at which point 50% of the mice will die. And that is the concept called LD50. And it turns out for alcohol, right, people drink alcohol all day long, all over the world. The LD50 is in grams per kilogram. Typically, that's how it's expressed. And it's 10.3 grams per kilogram. So if I sit at a bar and I drink 10.3 grams per kilogram of alcohol, 50% of people will die. So they've taken this LD50 concept and expanded it to things that were totally you would consider non-toxic, like bananas. So what do you think is the LD50 for bananas? How many bananas do you have to eat in one sitting for 50% of the population to die?
200.
That's pretty good, 250. 250. That assumes that you sit down and eat it at once. But 250 bananas. So they even go on and they say, well, what about the lethal dose 50 for jumping off buildings? So how many flights do I have to jump off of in order for 50% of people to die? Anyone know the answer to that?
3.
5.
So depending on where you look, it's somewhere probably about 4 to 5. 4 to 5. All right. So that's kind of the introduction to toxicology, right? That's kind of like the where does toxicology come from? But you know, we're not environmental toxicologists. We're certainly not recreational experimenters, right? We're medical people. So when someone comes in contact with the drug, right, and you go on a call and you get dispatched to somewhere, and you see a patient who you believe is poisoned, what is it that you want to know? Tell me some stuff. And I shouldn't have flipped the slide.
When they took it.
All right, great. When they took it, that's really important. What else? What they took. Okay, what does that mean, what they took? Okay, so what is the name? And also the amount, right? What else?
How they took it.
How they took it, right? The route. We talked about that. What else?
When they're supposed to take it.
How much they weigh. That's very important, right? Because we talked about, what's that?
Were they supposed to take it?
Were they supposed to take it? But that doesn't always, right? That's important. But their intent, right? So were they trying to harm themselves? Was it accidental? Are they supposed to be on digoxin? What else?
What that medication or drug does.
Great. The pharmacology of the drug. What else? Yeah, that's great. Chronicity. Did they take one big ingestion, or did they do it over several hours? So we have the drug, the size and weight of the patient, the time of the exposure, chronicity, any co-ingestion, right? Very rarely is a poisoned patient poisoned with just one thing. Usually they're taking benzodiazepines, alcohol, Percocet. What are their comorbidities? What medical problems do they have? Poisoned patients are a lot easier to take care of when they're young and healthy. There's a lot more room for error, so and intent, right? That's kind of someone said that. Were they supposed to be taking it? Were they trying to harm themselves? Because that adds a whole new element to the case. So let's give an example. While meaning to take his two high blood pressure tabs and an oral hypoglycemic pill, right? Instead of insulin, something like Lipizide, a medication, a pill that lowers the blood sugar. John Doe, who weighs 70 kilos, accidentally swallowed 3 tabs of extra strength Tylenol. Do you care? No. 50-50. Be wrong confident. Love it. Don't care, right? Because we know at 70 kilos, 3 extra strength Tylenol doesn't make a difference, right? I hope that patient doesn't come to the hospital. Right? Let's change the scenario. Jane Doe had read the medication label correctly and had been taking 2 tabs of 1 milligram Ativan for a whole week. All right? So let's assume that she's had 14 milligrams of Ativan instead of a half tab. Oh my God. Is that important? Does anyone here care? I say, RMA, go back to bed. No one cares, right? Because she's been doing this. We talked about the chronicity. You said that, right? Over how long did the exposure happen? And as it turns out, 2 milligrams of Ativan every day is a very, very small dose. All right. What about this case? A 3-year-old, John Doe, who weighs 15 kilos, swallows 3 of his grandfather's extra strength Tylenol that drop on the floor 10 minutes. Do we care about that? Yeah, why do we care about it? Because he's 15 kilos, right? It's 15 kilos. So all of a sudden, that dose-response relationship, that, how much do we say? Extra strength Tylenol is 500 milligrams. So that 1,500 milligrams is a lot more important in this John Doe than the previous John Doe, because he weighs 15 kilos. So this, potentially, is a very, very serious poison. And Tylenol is a fascinating drug. Everyone writes Tylenol off as, oh, this is Tylenol, over the counter. Tylenol is fascinating. It's been studied for years. Tons of papers written about it. We'll talk about Tylenol later. So now that we know kind of these are just some concepts in toxicology we're going to get into before we start talking about some specific drugs. Because in toxicology, I could bore you with lists and lists and lists and lists. It's really painful. It's much more interesting and meaningful to talk about concepts. So, gastric decontamination. What is gastric decontamination? Right? Emptying the stomach, right? Someone has, so for the rest of this lecture, I'm just going to tell you that for the most part, we're going to talk about ingestions, right? These are much more interesting. Gastric decontamination. We talk about gastric decontamination a lot. Activated charcoal, ipecac, right? So there are different types of ways to decontaminate a stomach. There's emetics, right? What's an emetic? Yeah, like ipecac, right? It's something that makes you puke. There's adsorbents, something that absorbs a chemical. What's charcoal? Great. There's lavage, meaning you wash it out. Lavage is a fancy word for washing out. And then there's cathartic simple bowel irritation. And we'll talk about this because gastric decontamination is, you know, probably we could sit and talk about gastric decontamination for 3 or 4 hours, but we won't. So ipecac is an emetic. It's plant-derived. Do we ever use ipecac here? In Darien, Connecticut, are we ever going to use ipecac? No. Is it on your ambulance?
No.
I hope so. Good. Otherwise I talk to the medical director. So, yeah, that's right, it is. And it turns out ipecac is a pretty dangerous drug. And the role of ipecac is very limited. What it is, it's plant-derived. You swallow it and it makes you puke, right? My girlfriend's dog is constantly eating things it shouldn't. And we give the dog ipecac quite frequently. But we don't want to get it to people. And part of the problem is if you take a drug like an opioid or a benzodiazepine that makes a patient sleepy, and you give them ipecac and they start puking uncontrollably for hours on end, what's going to happen? Well, they'll get dehydrated, that's true, and they'll choke and they'll ask for it. And that looks really bad when that happens. But that being said, right, and part of the issue why I say in Darien, Connecticut, is because you're pretty close to a bunch of hospitals. And you have paramedics close by who can intubate people. And so the scope is very, very limited here. But on the other hand, if you're out in nowhere America, where you're 5 hours from the local hospital, and someone has a lethal ingestion, right? Drug X, which is absolutely lethal, they might call the Poison Control Center, and they might say, yeah, give Ipecac, because otherwise this patient will die. So, is Ipecac ever given? Yeah, it is, but not ever here. And so the absolute contraindications to Ipecac are what? Unconscious, what else? Anything acidic or alkaline, good. Because it burns going down and then it burns coming up. What else? What's that? Not opioids. But if it's an unimportant ingestion, if it's that John Doe who's 70 kilos who took a meaningless ingestion, you don't want to make him. It's just not nice. So then there's the absorption, right? So activated charcoal, dose is a gram per kilo. And you never ever want to give charcoal to be punitive. What does that mean? Punishment, right? You don't ever want to give it to be a punishment. You did this, you woke me up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and now I'm going to make you drink this nasty stuff. Has everyone seen this? Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people do, surprisingly. And you know what happens when that happens? They end up aspirating and dying.
Oh my God.
What just happened?
Good.
Oh,
Hopefully I have the little charcoal up. So never as a punitive measure, because inevitably the patient will aspirate and die. And if you do that to be punitive, then you're a bad person, okay? And you're a terrible EMT or paramedic, because you're causing the patient harm. And there's no reason to do that intentionally just because they've done something angry. So when do we give charcoal? We give it if the ingestion happens within an hour. Once you're beyond an hour window, usually the gut has already absorbed it and there's nothing left for the charcoal itself to absorb. So essentially you're just pouring charcoal into an empty stomach. What are some exceptions? If you have a drug that's sustained release drug. Sustained release drug will be around for a while in the belly. Or if you have a drug that has anticholinergic properties. Anticholinergic properties slow the gut motility. So the drug stays in your stomach for a while. So in that case, up to 2, 3, 4 hours after the ingestion, can you give the charcoal and it'll be meaningful. Contraindications, abnormal mental status, right, they'll aspirate, or need for endoscopy. So if someone had an acid or alkali that burns the esophagus, then what the patient needs is endoscopy to see how bad the burn is. And if you stick a scope down the patient's esophagus, you're not going to see anything because it's covered in this nasty stuff. And then lastly, some drugs, some toxins aren't absorbed by charcoal. These primarily are heavy metals, iron, lithium, lead, right from our what do you call it, the element, or the table of elements or whatever, right? These are the metals, and they're not absorbed. So this is an E-wall tube, right? You shove this thing down the patient's esophagus. Usually they're intubated because no one can tolerate this. This isn't like your standard nasal gastric. It's like a garden hose. It's humongous. And you make the patient, you intubate the patient, you make them unconscious, you put it down their esophagus, you flush some fluid in, and then you take the fluid out in the hope of you get some of the pills out. No one ever does this anymore. It's way too complex. All right, cathartics. What's catharsis? Purging, right? So cathartic is a substance that you give to induce horrific diarrhea in an effort to flush out the GI tract and expel the toxic gas. things we use are sorbitol and polyethylene glycol. The problem with cathartics is they cause so much diarrhea, you can eventually get dehydrated and cause shifts in your electrolytes. So you can have cardiac abnormality, cardiac dysrhythmia. And then the other issue is research, right? We don't have any studies that show that whole bowel irrigation or cathartics actually make a difference in outcomes, right? Recently, there's this whole push of something called evidence-based medicine. If we're going to do these things to people that are fairly unpleasant, usually we like to have research showing that it's helpful. Otherwise, we're just doing an exercise in futility. And then it makes a huge mess because the patient has diarrhea all over, and you're not a fan of the nursing staff, right? And pretty much my job is to make the nurses happy. It's my sole function. All right, so that's gastric decontamination. So we talked about a couple concepts of toxicology. We talked about some of the background of what toxicology is. We talked about gastric decontamination. How do we make the diagnosis that a toxic exposure has actually happened? Right, patient comes in with a non-specific, I don't know, he's acting funny, right? Especially for a crowd like you guys, right? If you guys ever have a change in mental status, right, I hope that doesn't happen, then oftentimes because we're young, right, everyone in this room is young, then we're going to get labeled as having had a drug or an alcohol. And it's not fair, because oftentimes it's not. So, and the problem is when we stereotype people like that, we often miss important diagnoses that are reversible, like meningitis, right? Oh, this kid's just drunk, put him in the back, he'll sober up, we'll send him home. Well, in the meantime, his brain is cooking, right? And then when he doesn't wake up 6 hours later, you know you have a problem, and you don't look very smart. So how do we make the toxicology diagnosis? Everyone always talks about drug screen, let's do a drug screen, drug screen, drug screen, drug screen. Is a drug screen helpful? Not at all, not at all. The only reason I order drug screens are to make the internal medicine doctors happy. If they don't know what to do with the information. Drug screen is not helpful at all. What does a drug screen test for? Marijuana, PCP, cocaine, benzodiazepines, Ativan. But the issue is that if I do cocaine right now, and then I go to the ER 2 weeks later because I'm not feeling good, the cocaine is long gone, but my drug screen is still positive. So is that helpful? Not at all. The only person drug screen is helpful is little kids. Because should a little kid ever have cocaine in their urine? No. Totally abnormal. EKGs, cardiograms are great for toxicology emergencies because a lot of the drugs affect the heart rhythm, right? They cause abnormal cardiac dysrhythmias. So we can detect that with EKGs. X-rays, right? Sometimes you can actually see it. How often is that helpful? How often are X-rays helpful? Not very often. Not very often. So if you can get an X-ray, there are only 4 or 5 different drugs that will actually show up in the stomach. And that's only if they're still in the stomach and they're not absorbed. Drugs like iron, enteric-coated aspirin, heavy metals like lead. You can see those on X-ray, but only for a couple hours. And then you have specific drug levels, like alcohol, right? That can occasionally be helpful. ASA is aspirin. APAP is Tylenol, Dilantin. TCA is a tricyclic antidepressant, right? Those are very dangerous drugs in the wrong amount. And specific drug levels are interesting because I can get an alcohol level back within an hour, right? But just don't forget, even if the patient is drunk, it doesn't mean they didn't fall, hit their head, and have a subdural, right? So them being drunk doesn't exclude something else very serious. But something like a methanol level, who knows what methanol is? Ooh, yeah, someone said it. It's an alcohol, right? But it's different from bottled alcohol. You can't just go to your local liquor shop and get methanol. Methanol in any dose is very, very dangerous, and it's very lethal. And I can order a methanol level. It's very easy to, all I have to do is check the box. But the problem is it won't come back for 2 weeks. And the patient's long dead. So it's really not going to be helpful. So I need some other way to try and diagnose these toxicology emergencies. So what's the gold standard? The most important thing I can do is take a good history and do a good physical exam. It always goes back to the basics. Is that something you guys can do? You guys do history and physical? You do, and I hope you guys do it well, because that's probably the most important thing you're going to do. That and airway management. If you guys do a good history, physical exam, and airway management, you're okay. So what are toxidromes? Toxidromes are grouped abnormalities of vital signs and other physical exam findings, which are known to occur with specific classes of substances, right? So who can give me an example? You all know this toxidrome. Give me one example. What drug? What type of drug? All right, we'll talk about the cocaine toxidrome, but one even more basic. It's EMT 101. We know that too, but not from EMT class. But opioids, morphine. What happens when you take too many Percocets, or you get someone injects morphine? What happens to them? What do they look like? Their eyes. What happens to their eyes? They get pinpoint pupils. What happens to their respiratory tract? It drops. They become absent, right? What's their skin color become? Ashen or blue, cyanotic. What about their body? What happens to their skin? They're sweaty. They're like me. They're perspiring, right? And their vital signs, right? They become tachycardic, right? And this is the tachycardia is a response to the hypoxia because they're not breathing. So that's the opioid toxidrome. And as it turns out, there are a lot of toxidromes, right? There's a toxidrome for oral hypoglycemics, right? So a drug like glipizide. Glipizide is a pill that does the same thing that insulin does. So what does a diabetic coma patient look like who's hypoglycemic? They have altered mental status. What's their breathing look like? Yeah, they're breathing fast and shallow. What about their skin? They're very sweaty, right? And their mental status, right? They're acting funny, right? Oftentimes they're angry, they're violent. And so that would be a hypoglycemic toxidrome. So these are, what I'm going to talk to you now about 4 types of drugs or chemicals that have very specific toxidromes, okay? And this is what I said about taking a good history and physical exam. You can see this patient and you can make this diagnosis without a test, without spending $1, right? Not a single healthcare dollar. And you can make all of these diagnoses if you do a good history and a good physical exam. So the cholinergic toxidrome, right? Cholinergic is one of our neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, right? And we have an acetylcholine receptor. Has anyone ever heard of this? Biochemistry, neurology, psychology, right? Everyone's, probably not everyone, but a lot of people have heard of acetylcholine. And there's a specific receptor, and when you have too much acetylcholine, you develop something called the cholinergic toxidrome. And what that looks like is you're dry, your skin is very hot, it's red, right? You become very hot and warm, dry. You have changes of vision because the acetylcholine affects your the muscles in your eye, right? So all of a sudden you can't focus your eyes right. You become altered mental status, so mad as a hatter. You become, all your orifices dry up. So you develop dry throat, you don't urinate, you don't have bowel movements, your bowel sounds are decreased. So on physical exam, you're red, you're hot, you're dry, you're just dry everywhere. And that's the classic cholinergic toxidrome. So what causes the cholinergic toxidrome? Lots of things, right? So many things. In this list, my fingers started hurting just that. This is like a 2-minute pages. There's pages, pages, pages of things that cause cholinergic crisis. But if you notice, these are everyday things. Well, some of them. Antihistamines like Benadryl. Who here hasn't taken Benadryl? Right? Benadryl is a very safe drug. I gave Benadryl to a 6-month-old, right? But the key is to take it in the right amount. So Benadryl, anti-Parkinsonian agents, right? Anyone here have a family member with Parkinson's? If you don't want to say, that's okay. Parkinson's is a very, very debilitating disease, right? It's really causes incredible change and stress in the family. And we do whatever we can to help these people. And we put them on all sorts of drugs, anti-Parkinsonian drugs. And as it turns out, they have tremendous anticholinergic properties. Antipsychotics, everyone's heard of Haldol, right? Everyone likes bringing in the crazy patient. 2 and 5, what does that mean? Anyone ever heard that expression? 2 of Ativan, 5 of Haldol. Make them sleep. Don't want to hear the yell. So Haldol has a lot of different properties. And patients take, as an outpatient, you can get shots of Haldol, you can take tabs of Haldol. So all of a sudden, you have a patient who has psychiatric illness, who has anticholinergic crisis, and they're going nuts, right? And now you have a psychiatric illness compounded by a toxicology emergency. Atropine, right? Has everyone here done a cardiac arrest? Yeah, right? Atropine, standard ACLS, right? Atropine works because it's anticholinergic. We're trying to drive the heart rate up. Tricyclic antidepressant. Everyone's on an antidepressant. If you're not on an antidepressant, seeing a psychiatrist, it's like, come on, it's the thing to do, right? So the tricyclic antidepressant, all the bad ones. The tricyclic antidepressants are one of the first classes of antidepressants, right? Very, very common drug. It's a class of drugs, so there's many different types. Muscle relaxants. Anyone ever hear of Flexeril? So you see, does it help at all? No, it just makes you sleepy.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it just makes you sleepy, and the reason it makes you sleepy is because of its anticholinergic properties. Plants and over-the-counter remedies. There are a ton of over-the-counter remedies like Benadryl, Tylenol PM, which has Benadryl. All these over-the-counters have drugs in them that have anticholinergic properties. So then we have the reverse of the anticholinergic crisis, right? It's called the cholinergic crisis. So has anyone ever heard of cholinergic crisis? You guys have Mark 1 kits on there? You do. Why do we have Mark 1 kits on there? For nerve gas, exactly. So when you get exposed to a nerve gas, you can develop something called cholinergic crisis. So anticholinergic is hot and dry. What's the opposite of hot and dry? Wet, right? So you salivate, you lacrimate, right? You urinate, you defecate, you have diarrhea all over the place. It's pleasant. You have stomach pain because your gastric motility is increased so much. You're walking around just leaking, anal leakage. Emesis, you puke, right? So the way I remember this is water everywhere. If you have a hole, it's leaking. And it's also the killer bees, bronchorrhea, bronchospasm, and bradycardia, right? And that is the cholinergic cause. So what causes cholinergic crisis is the organophosphates and pesticides, right? You don't need to, God forbid, have some sort of chemical release to develop cholinergic crisis. Right? I once actually picked up a patient in North Stamford back in my pre-hospital days, and I picked him up he was working in a, that's what he did. He delivered the stuff to kill weeds. And a cop found him on the side of the road and he was acting all goofy. And we picked him up out of the car and you could smell the fumes coming out of the car because he was baking in this car on the side of the road in North Stamford. And he had essentially organophosphate toxicity. All right, this is the last one we'll talk about. The serotonin syndrome. Has anyone ever heard of serotonin? Yeah, what's serotonin about?
It's a neurotransmitter in the brain.
Good. So forget about what it does, or what it's supposed to do, but it's a neurotransmitter in the brain. And if you have too much of it, it causes something called serotonin syndrome. And serotonin syndrome is classic. There are 2 other things that can cause something like serotonin syndrome, but whenever you read about it in a book, it's always these 3 things lumped together. And it causes increased muscle tone, autonomic instability, and hyperthermia. So what is the sympathetic nervous system? Yeah, so it's a part of the nervous system that, whenever you hear sympathetic nervous system, you think of fight or flight, right? Your heart rate's going up, your blood pressure's going up. So these patients present with tachycardia, hypertension. You can't move their feet, right? Their reflexes are very brisk. Their muscles are stiff. And that's classic for serotonin syndrome. And it's pretty uncommon, but what's alarming is the amount of drugs that can cause serotonin syndrome. So all of the SSRIs, what are SSRIs used for? Yeah, antidepressants, right? Like I said, everyone's on an antidepressant, right? They come up with, every day there's a new use for an old antidepressant, right? Stuff like sleepwalking, restless legs, you know, little kids who pee in the bed at, right? Oh, he needs an SSRI, it'll fix it, right? So, sertraline, citalopram, fluvoxamine, we go back to the TCAs, right? We talk about those as antidepressants. Opioids, there's an opioid called meperidine. It has very, very strong serotonergic properties. So if you know, grandma, right, is on an antidepressant because she's using it as an anti-anxiety medicine, very common, right? And all of a sudden her doctor is old school and says, oh, you have some chronic back pain, here's some meperidine. Next thing you know, she comes into the ER with a temperature of 104 and she's all worked out because she has serotonin. Very not, it's not uncommon at all. What's fenfluramine? You guys are. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, that's exactly right. So fenfluramine was the active ingredient in fen-phen, right? Fen-phen was a weight loss drug, and it killed a lot of people because it caused dysrhythmias. And the reason it did that is through serotonin. All right, last drug we're going to talk about, Tylenol. I love Tylenol. It's like the best drug. It works. It's not expensive. I don't have to write a prescription for it. It's a phenomenal drug. However, in the wrong dose, it's very lethal. It kills if you take it in the wrong dose. Normally, when you take Tylenol, it's metabolized by the liver. Anyone know that Tylenol is toxic? Right? You think of Tylenol, it's like a, I don't know, it's like, they sell it in the gas station for like $2 for like 3 tablets. So it's metabolized by the liver by something called the cytochrome P450 system, right? Totally unimportant. You don't need to know anything about that. I'm sorry, let's back up. It's metabolized by the liver by 2 enzymes, the major pathway. A very small percentage is by the cytochrome P450 enzyme. The problem is about 5 to 10% of the amount of Tylenol that you take. The problem is that the cytochrome P450 system produces a metabolite called NAPQI. And NAPQI is extremely toxic, and it just destroys you. And so, if you take too much of it, and the normal enzymatic process is overwhelmed, because all of a sudden the body sees a massive Tylenol load, more and more of the Tylenol is going to be metabolized by the cytochrome P450 system, and you'll develop more NAP. So the toxic dose of Tylenol is 140 milligrams per kilo, right? Or about 7.5 grams in 24 hours. And that goes back to what you said. It depends on how long, over what period of time you ingested the Tylenol. Did I, especially today, right? You go to Costco, you get these humongous bottles of Tylenol, Motrin, right? It's easy. You can eat several grams worth of Tylenol in one of those bottles. And people don't appreciate how dangerous it is. So someone is trying to threaten to harm themselves, maybe for attention, and all of a sudden they ingest a couple grams of Tylenol because they thought, it's not really going to hurt me, right? They can get into really serious trouble. And the problem with Tylenol is it's everywhere. It's in every drug. Go home, look in your pharmacy cabinets at home. Everything you have is Tylenol, and people don't understand that. And the other big problem with Tylenol is when you are sick from Tylenol, it takes about 24 hours for you to feel sick. So your liver is already in the fire, right, from the Tylenol, and you don't even know. You're totally asymptomatic. It's not like most of these other drugs where if you're sick from toxic exposure, you're going to know about it. You're going to be acting funny. You're not going to feel well. You'll vomit, you'll have diarrhea. Not Tylenol. You'll be frying your liver for 24 hours, and then all of a sudden you'll start to feel sick. You'll throw up, you'll have some diarrhea, you'll have some belly pain. I think I have gallstone. Right? It's just a gallstone. I don't know, it's something I ate. It's not the 10 grams of Tylenol I took yesterday. It's just Tylenol. So that's day 2 or 3. And as you come to day 2 or 3, and I do your liver function test, they're through the roof. They're in the hundreds to thousands. And then by day 3 or 4, your liver's failed. When your liver fails, your intracerebral pressure goes sky high, then you herniate your brain, and it's game, set, match. Check. Very few people recover from toxic acetaminophen exposures. All right. Now, one of the great things about Tylenol, right? I love Tylenol. It works. It's cheap. No prescription. If we can help these people. If I catch someone at the right time, I can give an antidote, right? Like Narcan for opioids, and I can actually save someone's life from a toxic Tylenol exposure. Anyone know the name of that? It's called NAC. NAC. It stands for N-acetylcysteine. And back in the day, there was only an oral formulation. It smelled like rotten eggs, so no one wanted to drink it. And some ingenious pharmaceutical company came up with intravenous never. It doesn't sting. It's very expensive, but it saves lives. It actually saves lives. And it's no side effects. Totally harmless. So these smart dudes named Rumack and Matthew got together and they created a normal treatment. And so this here is acetaminophen concentration in the blood, and this here is time. And this is the acetaminophen concentration per time. So at 4 hours, right, if I take a massive Tylenol ingestion right now, what time is it? It's 8:30.
And how many pills is massive?
Well, so what we said, about 8 grams.
But how many pills is
Well, it depends if it's extra strength, regular strength.
Extra strength.
So extra strength is 500 milligrams per calorie.
How many of those makes
16. There you go. Must be a business.
It would be 16 in your cover.
So this here is 200. This is 200. This level is 200. So at 200, if your Tylenol level after 4 hours of ingestion, assuming the ingestion occurred at once, and if it's greater than 200, then you got a problem, and you need that, right, to save your liver, to pull it out of the fire. The FDA came along and told Rumack and Matthew, yeah, we like what you did. You guys are pretty smart. You guys are onto something. But we don't want to miss anyone. We want to make sure we save every liver we can. Liver failure is a bad way to go. So what the FDA said, well, Rumack and Matthew suggested 200. We're going to make it 150. That way, anyone who's even close will save. And so if your Tylenol level at 4 hours is 150 or greater, we start to run that. All right, I got to give a shameless plug here for poison control centers. Poison control centers are outstanding. Anyone ever call them? Yeah? What's it like when you call them?
They're very thorough.
Yeah, what do they ask you for?
Yes.
Or just describe, you know, if you would, describe your experience.
We just did a pediatric patient that had an overdose of parents' medication. The age of the patient, how much they weigh, what the dose of course they took, how long ago they took it, under what circumstances they took it. They ask you where you are, house, place, how long since your arrival.
What did they tell you? What was the outcome in that case?
Actually, they just told us to go to the hospital.
They did.
Those were the days that they had. I'm sure they were.
So the great thing about Poison Control Center is they make my job easy. Because oftentimes, like we talked about, these exposures are not serious. And they say, no, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Don't waste your time or money. Just stay home. The kids can be fine. Or the adults can be fine. But as it turns out, I encourage anyone, whoever needs, this is a national number. So it doesn't matter if you're in Darien, you're in Norwalk, you're in Philadelphia, you're in California. It's like dialing 911. You automatically get routed to the nearest poison control center. And they're awesome. I've never met a poison control operator who I didn't think was terrific. And they get this information from you, and they give you great advice. And if they have a problem, right, because oftentimes these are nurses, they're people with master's degrees, very few initial people that you'll get on the phone are physicians. But they have toxicologists that are on the phone. And they report, they collect the data that you give them, and they say, oh, we have an SSRI exposure, we have Tylenol exposure. And what's good, if you call this number, aside from getting good advice, sound medical advice, you also boost their numbers. And then when they go to the federal government and say, hey, we took this many thousand calls, then they'll get more money. like I said, where I trained in Philadelphia was very toxicology heavy. We had Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that sponsored our poison control center. My attendance would call for poison control, and it's really an outstanding resource. So if you ever need it, they're there for you. The Poison Control Center here, I believe, is based out of DuPont, I think in Farmington, and they're absolutely terrific. And so very rarely do I actually need help with a toxicology case, but I often call, even for the most minor cases, just to help boost their numbers and make it look good. All right. Any questions at all? I know it's kind of a lot of information. Pretty much on the dot, 1 hour. Everyone stay away.